Welcome to all of you who have come here. I know that we all have a lot going on in our lives right now, so I really appreciate you taking the time to be here and do this together. I'm Stacey Fitzsimmons. I'm an associate professor of international business at Gustavson School of Business at University of Victoria. And today, I've got two of my absolute favorite people and really strong consultants in this diversity, equity, and inclusion space who are going to be sharing some of their expertise about what works and what we can be doing in the medium term, especially. We were originally planning, so let me give you their introductions, right? So we've got Wyle Baoween, and he's the CEO of HRX. It's a diversity, equity, inclusion consulting based out of Vancouver. And we also have Farzana Nayani, who is both a diversity, equity, inclusion consultant and also has a recently published book. So I think Shannon is sharing her links to her book in the chat. Feel free to click on that and you can see it's Raising Multiracial Children, Tools for Nurturing Identity in a Racialized World. And it's hot off the presses with Penguin Press. Let's see, we had originally planned to run this webinar as a follow-up to our previous webinar. If you want to know a little bit more about, especially about our two panelists in the previous webinar, they both shared how they came into this space and their personal journeys a little bit. And that one is especially around the idea of closed borders. Right now, however, is a good time for companies to use the disruption of both the pandemic and the current racial equity protests happening globally right now to do things better than we have before. So instead of focusing on how companies should respond this week or immediately, we're talking about a slightly longer time frame over the next few months as companies reopen and start to operate in the new normal. So by the end of this webinar, you should come away with ideas for how business leaders can reduce systemic and racial inequities in their organizations as the economy reopens. By equity, just quick definition, we're talking about making sure everyone has fair access and opportunity. So during this pandemic, as a bit of context, we've been hearing, prior to this week's protest, we've been hearing from some business leaders that addressing issues of diversity, equity, inclusion is for the good times, right? That's for when you've got the capacity and you can address some of these, nice to haves. But right now, what we're arguing, and obviously what the protests are also showing, is that this is important always. And the reasons are because treating people equity is always the right thing to do, regardless of business impacts. And especially right now, because the pandemic has not treated people equally, right? And Farzana is going to be sharing a few examples of that in just a moment. But for right now, the chat is open. And by the way, although the session is recorded, the chat is not. So feel free to use the chat and you won't be recorded for what you write in the chat there. I want to start with a quick question to you. Do you think that the pandemic will further widen inequities in the workplace? Do you think it'll have no impact or possibly even reduce inequities? So please write your answers there. While you're writing that, I'm going to share a bit of context about where we were prior to the pandemic. I published this research in January together with my Gustavson colleagues, Jen Baggs and Mary Yoko Brannon. Let me share the slide here. Where do I do that? Here we go. You can take a look. I hope, can you see that? Good. And what you see here is that we have some research and it was an intersectional analysis. So we took all combinations, I think it was 24 combinations of immigrant generation, gender, race, and mother tongue. Now, big, huge caveat here is that most of these are binary, and that's because it's coming from Statistics Canada. So it's dependent on the type of data they were collecting. So you don't get any detail, but what we do get is we do get a broad brush analysis about the combined effects of all of these things on Canadian salaries. And so what we found was pretty interesting. What we found is that there was about a $10,000 annual salary difference between the groups with the most privileges and the groups with the most barriers. We call these barriers to access and employment. And on average, and I say this with a lot of hand waving and caveats, that you can kind of add them up. And it statistically predicted salary. So for example, the group with the most barriers was a group of first generation women, immigrant women of color whose mother tongue was not English or French, right? And they had a salary deficit, as you can see here, first generation immigrants, women, person of color, and they did not have the same salary, of around $8,300 salary deficit. As a result of these demographic characteristics. The only groups that had a salary premium, surprisingly, were also immigrants, but it was first generation immigrant men and their white, as long as whites, and their white sons. So we can see here that even prior to the pandemic, we definitely have an issue here in Canada. I see some people talking about how it's just an American thing, and we need to have a lot of introspection here in Canada. This is happening here as well. And I think I've got the links in the slides if you want to see a little bit more of that. Farzana, do you have a bit more to share about examples?
Yes, thanks, Stacey, for that research. When it came out, I was very excited to see it, not for what it showed in terms of the gaps, but just the fact that we have that type of evidence of what we're seeing in the field. As was mentioned, my name is Farzana Nayani. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm based in Los Angeles, but I've spent half of my life in Canada, and I do work in both places. And what we're seeing is that there is an uptick in a lot of inequity widening. So for those of you who said that in the chat, that is what we're seeing. Some really stark examples include a lot having to do, let's even start with gender. So we're seeing the gap widening in terms of, because of COVID-19 and things being shut down and childcare not being available, schools being brought home, and now summer around the corner, we're seeing women actually leaving the workforce because they have to choose in their family, in their household, who will take care of their children. And so those hard conversations are being had. We're seeing this in articles and webinars where women are having to leave the workforce because their salaries are already lower. So if it's between them and let's say a male partner, that's what we're seeing. Of course, we have same-sex couples, et cetera, but we're just seeing that as a trend. As we're seeing with the healthcare disparities around people of color who are dying at disproportionate rates, and the bias around them not being served when they do try to go to the hospital and are refused, turned away, or their symptoms are not seen as something that it needs care in the same way as white counterparts. That has been a traumatic experience for in particular Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities who have been ravaged by COVID-19. Everyone has felt the impacts of this around the world, but those communities in particular are suffering. And lastly, the large example on everyone's minds right now is racism and police brutality, and how in particular Black lives are treated around the world. We're seeing in the United States and in Canada also, in terms of how people are reacting to the news within protests and just the bias that is there around how people are treated. As a part of this also is that uptick in anti-Asian racism. So that has been always going on with the COVID experience, because with the coronavirus, having originated in China, people are saying it's the Chinese virus, and people's homes and businesses are being vandalized, and people are being targeted, and there's violence against Asians. So this is all on the backdrop of what has already been going on, as you could see in your research, and now it's just heightened.
Right. Thanks a lot, Farzana. And that's a really good segue into our next section, because really what we're trying to figure out here is, well, what are we supposed to do about that? So next question for all of you here in the chat is, how confident are you that you would know what to do to improve workforce equity during the reopening process, right? As the economy is reopening, hopefully, how confident are you that you know what to do? And take a look in the chat and see if you can answer that one there. And as Farzana said, is the context is that previously we have a lot of problems, and the pandemic, as both Farzana's examples show, and most of you in the chat seem to think that inequities are actually going to increase as a result of the pandemic. So this is really critical for us to do this thoughtfully. Let's see. So it looks like from the answers that are coming in so far, I see some reasonably confident. It's about being aware and educating ourselves from Vivian. Raymond says that ingrained racism is difficult to eliminate. Absolutely. We're going to be addressing a few of these things coming up. To start thinking about what might work, I'm just going to share some research that's not done by me. This was published in Harvard Business Review. Let me share the slides again. Here we go. So this was by two researchers named Dobbin and Kalev. And what they did is they examined around about 800 firms and about 30 years of data. And they were trying to really just see what works when it comes to diversity and inclusion activities. So first of all, we're going to say here's some where they found poor evidence of success. And they were defining success as pure diversity, looking at the numbers. Does it increase the numbers of these different demographic characteristics you see on the chart here, or does it decrease it? And these three, they found poor evidence of success. Now, all of these types of programs are done with good intentions, usually, I'm assuming. However, some of the problems happen when people come in and they apply them poorly. So for example, mandatory diversity training, right? It seems like a natural thing to do. I often see this from my students where they say, hey, what we need to do is we just need to make sure everyone goes through diversity training, and as a result, they will all be changed. But what happens when you make training mandatory, and this is not related to just diversity, this is training in general, people often resist it, right? They get resentful, they don't want to do it, and as a result, learning doesn't tend to happen. So one of the effects they found is that mandatory diversity training had all of the white squares. They either had no evidence or there was no statistical difference. And then you see that some of the squares, there was a negative effect. Job test, what this is where when you're hiring, do you have some sort of supposedly objective test that you use to see whether people are qualified? But what happened when they dug into the data is they found that often these were applied poorly, meaning that they were not applied to everyone, right? White men often got a pass when they were applying for a job, whereas people of color and women were often asked to do the test. So as an end result, when they were applied inconsistently, you ended up with some negative effects. And finally, grievance systems, again, because people do funny things, when they're applied poorly, it can result in retaliation against people who submit grievances, and as a result, people are resistant to, so people don't want to submit grievances, and you can end up with negative effects as a result. So here's a few things. Now, they did find some things that often did work well, and some of them are pretty surprising. Overall, the things that worked well tended to frame diversity in a very positive light, right? So we're looking at the benefits that we get from diversity and why this is an important thing for us to do. For example, voluntary training. No, you're not going to get everyone in the workforce to go through voluntary training, but those people who do are truly committed to the cause, and they often end up advocating to their colleagues who didn't go through it. So you end up with overall over your workforce with a better effect. And then some things were interesting in how they work. So for example, these targeted recruitment programs where they had people go into colleges, they worked not necessarily because they found people directly through the recruitment, but they also worked because the managers themselves who went on these college visits were changed. The managers, even if they themselves weren't diversity advocates prior to going on these college visits, after doing them, they came back to the workforce, were convinced about the importance, and they would often become advocates for diversity as a result of going on these college visits. So it's an interesting mechanism. And then finally, I'm going to mention that they have a lot of non-diversity activities, things like self-managed teams and cross-training that just make sure people circulate within the organization. You don't end up with such insularity, which can often happen within teams, and you end up promoting people as a result of them getting access to more people. And sorry, the last one I'm going to mention is the accountability. And that's something that Wyle is going to be hitting on a little bit as he talks about some metrics and how to track it. And all of these things work best when the managers are responsible for improving what's happening in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion within their teams. So from here, that's enough from me. I want to turn now to go back. I've stopped sharing, right? Yeah, good. So I want to turn now, I'm going to go to Wyle first and ask you so what should leaders be doing to improve the state of diversity, equity, and inclusion in their organizations?
Okay. Well, thank you, Stacey. Thank you, Farzana. That was great, really. And thank you, everyone, for joining. You know what, when we started planning for this session, as Stacey said, we were talking about businesses and economy, and that was our focus. And what happened last week, the last 10 days, you just can't really get yourself out of the social impact and like what's happening on the streets and what's happening in these conversations we are having with our like family members, with our neighbors, with our friends around social justice, around race, around complicated things like privilege and oppression and all of that. So I won't go into all of that. That would be like a different conversation to go through. But I will go to a model in social science around how change work in our society. Our society is complicated, right? It's interesting because we as people, we are the of these societies. It's fascinating, huh? We make an impact and we get impacted by that. So for change, there are three categories. This is like broad categorization. One of them is advocacy. So there are people who are advocating for change. These are people who work within the system. You start a company, you start a non-for-profit, you bring people together, you go and try to make change within the system. So these are advocates. And then there are activists. There is working outside of the system. So what we see now, because of all this anger, is activism. People going out, they're angry. They want change and they won't wait for the system to change slowly and for people to get convinced. No, they will go out to change. And it's sad, but also it is a really good opportunity to hear these voices. And then the third one is agency. And I think agency is relevant to the business because agency is when you have the power to make change. If you are a CEO, if you are a department leader, if you are a professor, you have students, and if you're a mayor, if you're a prime minister, you have power. And some of you report, someone comes to you and report inequity and injustice. You have power to make change, you know? So I'm sure some of you are somewhere in that. Some of you have the power, some of you are working within the system, and some of you think that, no, I want to find different ways to talk about this and make change. What's happening in the street could happen in your work. The pandemic and the state of racism and gender inequality and social justice could reflect on your business. You are now navigating a very different environment than 3 months ago or 4 months ago. And we all need to be aware of. So the mental health, the challenges, the pressure, you know, Farzana was talking about families that are in a very different place now, coming back to work. And the pressure on them, and like maybe one of them will have to quit, mostly if there is like a woman and a man in the family, mostly the women will have to leave the workforce. So as a leader, I think all of us need to come back and really have different set of tools that are very, very, very focused on our people, you know, and I think all of us need to come back with much more capacity to listen. I think that's a very important one. There are voices now, they're expressing their frustration, their anger, their concern, their fear, and it is time for all of us to listen. So that's the first one. I think listening and giving that space to listen and allowing people to talk. And if we have different race or different gender, I think we need to like just listen to the issue from the other person as is, no judgment, you know? So that's the first one. I think it's time for all of us to learn more. I really think if we are privileged or other, we have to learn about the struggle, the challenge of minorities and what they go through. So that's an important thing. I think reading, educating ourselves, it is our duty to learn about injustice and inequality and systemic racism, sexism, and all these issues that we are really seeing in our societies. So that's the second one. I always talk about creativity. Our business now is different than our business 3-4 months ago. We are using different tools now. Look at me, I'm sitting on I didn't do that before. And it is necessity. We have to be more creative. We have to do things differently. We have to be open to that, you know? And I think that the best source for creativity comes from our people. So come back to that listening and learning point. It is time for us to tell people, okay, tell me what to do. If you think there is something that need to change, is something to need to improve, tell me what to do. We will reflect on diversity task force and employee resource groups. I think they are fascinating source of suggestions and the last one I talk about all the time is data. Data is important. Data is very important. And it's very like unfortunate that here in Canada, we are not tracking the COVID-19 data by race. There is a lot of push for that because that's where you start realizing there's an issue. This is where you start telling people, okay, there is racism. There is systemic racism. And I heard yesterday on CBC, what's his name? Don, this guy, he was talking, he's like, you know, I don't agree that we have racism here in Canada. We are much better than the States. And that's pure privilege, pure unawareness of what people are going through. We have people getting in jail and stopped and searched just based on their colors. You know, the data shows that. We have inequality in our health systems, as Farzana was talking about. Education, housing, poverty. You know, I am Middle Eastern. Middle Eastern communities here in Canada are making way less money than the average Canadian. Just look at all of them and you see that and you're like, why? Some of them are educated, some of them are have really good jobs. Like why as a society we are not on par with the average Canadian? And that's because of the systemic racism that we see. And unfortunately it is here in Canada. So these are the things. I think it's time to listen, time to learn, time to be creative, compassionate. And I think it's time to really get data and rely on data if we really want to make systemic change.
Thanks so much, Wyle. And to those of you, I'm sorry, Wyle, you were cutting in and out a little bit there.
Oh, sorry.
But it was a good summary at the end. For those of you who want to learn more, his company does a lot of really great analytics. It's one of the things that they do particularly well. So look to HRX if you want some diversity and inclusion analytics at your firm. Farzana, what do you?
Thank you, Wyle, so much for that. I think the framework of social change and thinking about how we interact with one another in the process of this is so hugely important. And what I'm seeing right now is this frenzy of action and reaction. And I think that what there isn't enough of is what you said, is this intentional listening and thinking through before we, you know, put out a statement or take a stance on something. There's just this panic right now because of the dire state of affairs that we're all in, from the healthcare issue to what we're seeing with racism and then our economic crisis. All of that is just compounding into this really conflict-ridden time. So I think the frameworks that you shared are hugely important. So thank you for that. I want to offer some steps also here for everyone around some strategies that I think can be helpful. And in particular, this is aimed at organizations. And, you know, the first thing is thinking about how we work with this externally and internally. So externally, what we're seeing is a lot of companies making a public statement, either it being some stance, whether it be around Black Lives Matter or the economic crisis or safety and security of their employees. That's something that shows the values of an organization, of a company. At the same time, we're seeing companies making large donations to causes, and that is also a stance. So that's an external reaction and action that's taken. At the same time, internally, there is a lot of dialogue that's happening, and that includes employee resource groups, which are demographic groups based on the affinity, you know, either it being race or gender or what have you. So we're seeing engagement of those groups, which you know, I work a lot with them, and I feel like they're the #1 resource for a lot of companies to really feel the pulse of what's going on. At the same time, we don't want to burden people of certain demographics because it involves them. We want to create community and build community and allow for voices and stories to be told, but then also not have the responsibility on their shoulders. So there's this delicate balance in trying to include that dialogue, and listening is a key part of it, for sure. The third thing has to do, it's both internal and external. It's around strategy. So what is your diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy? Was there one before? Are you now starting one? And who can you get input from? Is it, you know, consultants? Is it internally you have a committee? Are you going to hire someone? Are you going to have, you know, input from an external source? And an example I can give is, you know, I speak a lot at conferences, and I created a DEI asset inventory so organizations can just see what assets they have and do an inventory. So you know, I could give that out to everyone here if that's of interest to folks. So these things are all purposeful in terms of the organization. Now, the thing that I feel like we're also missing out on and missing is how employees are feeling right now. Employees are you know, in trauma, they're in pain, they're also you know, in struggle with these things being surfaced. It's a very traumatic time for a lot of people, even you know, starting with the Black community and seeing the deaths and the bias, and then also other people of color communities who are re-traumatized in their own way by witnessing this. And then you're seeing just the general public rising to face this. And I in particular am now focusing on the wellness and the healing of employees. I feel like that we are in a time of crisis, with the economic crisis, with, you know, the loss of life, loss of jobs. And that is the #1 priority for me. And I feel that organizations maybe are not taking the first step with that. They're doing all the other 3 things that I just talked about. So I encourage us to all look at all levels of this, and at the same time, really take care of our people. We need to take care of the people who are a part of what we do, who are the reason for us being here, the public, our employees, our managers who are carrying so much weight, and really, you know, see what is needed here.
Great. Thank you so much to both of you. Really great wealth of experience working with firms and seeing what's worked with the firms that you've worked with. I'm going to do a quick summary of what Wyle and Farzana have each shared. While I'm doing that, please feel free to use the question and answer right now and ask your questions for our experts here who can share with you, can hopefully answer some of your questions about what to do. So a quick summary, what Wyle was saying was he kind of hit on 3 points. He was specifically and most importantly talking about how now is a time for listening and empathy and without judgment. And there's a question, Wyle, already in the Q&A about that. So maybe take a look at that, about how to have those kinds of difficult conversations in a non-judgmental way by Sangeeta. And then talking about the role of creativity, because this, when we're framing it in a positive light, the best evidence shows that diversity has a positive effect on creativity. And right now during a pandemic, this is the time for creative thinking. So this is the time when we really need to leverage the diversity that already exists in our organization and make sure we're valuing it. And then the importance of good data, right? And that we saw in the stats that I showed about what works, right? We need some accountability, and the easiest and best way to do the accountability is through analytics, people analytics, but it tends to be quite hard to do well. So you want to find someone who can do that accurately and do it well. And then Farzana had her 4-step plan where she was talking about organizations taking a stance, and they can do that through words, certainly, but even much better to do it through actions. And then engaging with employee resource groups. And by the way, since most of our population here is Canadian on the webinar, employee resource groups tend to be more common in the States than they are in Canada. And it's something that we as Canadians can really think about and use in our organizations. That's a great way to listen and to hear from different demographics. Diversity and equity and inclusion strategy, right? Tying this into the strategy of the organization rather than an add-on at the side. That can really help. And Farzana, I think everyone would love to see your DEI asset inventory. That would be wonderful if you're willing to share that. And then finally, the idea of tapping into employee feelings and wellness. This isn't always about productivity and improving the employee organization's bottom line. We also need to really think about our people as people. In the previous webinar that the 3 of us did together, we were talking much more closely about people's identities and how identities can be affected in a time of the pandemic and closed borders. So if you're interested in some of that conversation, then take a look at our previous webinar, how we were discussing that. That's all I have to say now. I'm going to turn now to the questions. And it looks like, can either of you address that first question? So Sangeeta says, systemic change requires courageous conversations. How does one create the space to have these conversations in a non-judgmental way? It's a great question. Thanks, Sangeeta.
Okay, here, I'll take that one. Sangeeta, hi. Great to see you here. Thank you very much. Great question. Courageous conversations come from courage. You know, so the person who's conducting these conversations needs to have courage. And courage is not like, not only like addressing things and not being afraid of speaking up and all of that. Courage also is perfect, right? Courage is admitting that in some ways we are privileged, you know? Courage is admitting that I might be wrong, you know, and the person, when they say something, I might feel like they're criticizing me, but no, they're just like telling me what they feel. So that's one thing. The other thing is, if you are a leader and you want to create a safe space, and you are afraid or you are worried or you're anxious about, okay, not being able to connect with a specific group, have your counsel, I call it. Have your counsel who can guide you through that. So if I want to create a space for people in my organization who are, I don't know, immigrants, you know, and I am not an immigrant. I don't feel like I am qualified to talk or like to approach or like to design solution for that group. Why not have a leader from that group to help me and consult with me and guide me? You know, we have a great example with one of our clients where they wanted to celebrate Ramadan, the month of Ramadan with their Muslim employees, and the leader was not a Muslim, and she didn't know what to do. And she consulted some leaders that organization, slaughter organization, and helped her. They told her, do it this way, that this time, this is how you design it. So have these advisors for you, like diversity advisors, or like inclusion advisors, I call them. And then some of these conversations, when you start digging and like getting these conversations, they will not be comfortable. So just be prepared for that, you know, like, and prepared for that means you don't just go into it. No, I think you have to have a plan. You have to have a plan, you have to be prepared, you have to consult, ask people who have experience in this. Totally. So I have heard so many conversations that the intentions was great, but then the impact was just awful. You know, it got heated, it wasn't managed very well, it wasn't facilitated very well, and it didn't really deliver like what was the purpose. I hope that's helpful, Sangeeta.
Thanks, Wyle. Farzana? Yeah, I think that last point about how things can go wrong is huge. I think we're really mindful of that, and I think that in some ways that creates fear in people from even starting the conversation because we're worried we might say something wrong. But I think that the key here is that it's a step in the direction of progress. Like we're making efforts, we want to have input, more of the listening, and just being really vulnerable in that. And I think that is a key for leaders, like the leader you mentioned, Wyle, who was able to receive input from people. So I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I think the key also is around vulnerability and sharing what the needs are.
Yeah, thanks so much, Farzana. The next question, actually, two people had very similar questions, Andrea and Amanat. By the way, Amanat is one of our incoming PhD students. So she starts in September. Hopefully she's able to move to Victoria. Welcome, it's good to see you, Amanat. But they were both really concerned with the greenwashing aspect of this, right? Where organizations say all the right things, they've got these lovely statements, but then, for example, Andrea gave the example of sports teams that have racist names. I can imagine you might be considering the Edmonton Eskimos, who put out a lovely statement in support of anti-racism, and got a lot of blowback about that just a couple days ago. So Farzana and Wyle, do you have anything to say about this possibility and what to do about it specifically?
Farzana, I'll let you go first.
Great, thanks. I think along with the lines of what I just said around there being vulnerability and this being a journey, that if organizations, as they put the statement as a North Star of where they're working towards, and understand that there are gaps, and maybe by using data or assessments, being really clear and transparent about where those gaps are and what plan they have to address those gaps, I think that will address some of the issues in terms of the challenge around it just being lip service. So how that can be done is through a statement, and I do work with organizations around statement, policies, and plans that they can create. So you have your statement that is the direction you're going and your vision and your mission with regards to DEI work, but then you have your policies in place that inform it and hold the accountability, which is the question here, of the organization, of certain departments, of HR, of whatever facets and functions are addressed in that. And then the plan is actually how to implement it. And so more often than not, we're sort of struggling with different parts of this at the same time. And I think what we're seeing in this current time is people putting out this statement without necessarily having the policy or plan to back it up. And that could be not knowing what to do. So part of that is knowing that there are these different aspects of it. At the same time, putting out a statement without having it can create this blowback. And so we're seeing people who say Black Lives Matter and we're against racism. And then people on Twitter are showing their board of directors that is 100% white male. and saying, how can you have this statement and at the same time have this as your reality? And that's just the reality of the workplace with Fortune 500 CEOs. There's just not that many people who are from underrepresented communities, right? Or women. So there are big shifts that have to change in organizations. And I think the more that people voice what they want to see, and then the hiring practices and the policy practices can come into play, that we can find some parity soon.
Yeah. For these organizations, you know, some of them are just saying it just to look good, you know. So like there is pressure, they are saying it, and that's it. I don't like for these organizations. Hopefully, you remember the model we talked about, change. Hopefully, advocacy, activism, and agency will change that. Maybe the government will impose things. Maybe policies and regulation will have them push them to change. Maybe people will do that. You know, maybe their customers will push them to do that. Maybe like social pressure will change that. Or maybe internally, someone will be there and will be frustrated and will push for change and fight for change. So one case. And then I was talking about the organization that have good intentions, like they want to change, you know, but unfortunately, that effort is not translated to actual change. And there are so many reasons for that. Not being prepared, not knowing what change will take, didn't really align that change with what's important for the organization. And I see that a lot. They want to be diverse, but they don't know why, you know? And like, how is that important for them? So whenever there is a crisis, that diversity effort goes to the shelf. So for that, if they have the good intention, hopefully that's the you can like work with them. You have good intention. Let's align it with the impact.
Okay. And if I could just add to that, you've inspired me, Wyle, because I think that what we're in right now is the catalyst, right, for the change. So there are probably organizations like what you described that want to do it, but didn't have the momentum to, or had to prove it to even more senior leadership or what have you. They weren't in alignment in different parts of the organization.
Absolutely.
So this is, in a way, there could be some hope here. There's some kind of hopeful direction we can take with it sparking the momentum, the interest, the accountability, right? The need for data, the honoring of voices, everything that you talked about that I've just said. So we could look at that as a means for kind of having faith and trust in this process, that it's something we needed to go through in order to get to the next step.
Really good stuff. And I see two questions that are related to what you've both been saying. So I'm going to skip down. These are two questions that came in near the bottom by Merrick. By the way, Merrick came as a volunteer. He shared one of his most challenging leadership situations with my students last year. So he's nicely tied as a mentor to our business students, and Sangeeta as well. And the two of them together, they're asking really, what are the core elements within either corporate culture or Sangeeta's kind of reframing in terms of strategy that organizations need to have in place, right, in order to avoid some of this greenwashing that we've been talking about?
Wyle, do you want to start off?
Okay, so you are absolutely right. I like culture eats strategy for breakfast. By nature, by background, by traits, by personality, there are more people who are more inclusive. The way that they experience things, their traits, they have courage, they have humility, they have curiosity, you know, they were in places where they just explored and learned about others and the inequities and the struggle of others. So they became more inclusive. Organization cultures are the same. There are some organizations that are more inclusive just by the way they were formed, and the leader and the CEO and the founder and the customers and the product they produce, you know. So these are easier to just structure them in a way that they do better impact, you know. Like, it's, you go there, you work with them, and you're like, oh, you are actually great, you care about learning, you have a growth mindset, you believe in people, you care about people. So these are the things you need to be more inclusive and diverse. And there are cultures and industries that are hard, just hard, you know, just like by the nature of the lack of diversity, by the mentality of the industry, that are really hard. I reflect always on how humble the leaders are, how curious, how, as I said, courageous, and how committed they are to their people. When I see that, I know that, okay, that will be really easy work for us. And I go to places where, no, they are not humble. They have really very big issues with humility. They have issues with admitting mistakes, admitting imperfections, being interested in others, and like the way others think and experiences, and the way they are treating their people. And when I see that, I know that, you know what, it will be a very long and hard project to make change here.
Yes, I can really echo that and add, I think that the perspective on equity, diversity, and inclusion is also huge. For example, if people think it's an accessory to the business that needs to be tacked on or bolted on or is an afterthought, it's not going to succeed. It's just going to fail. And what we need then is an organizational culture that appreciates diversity as an integrative part of every single facet of the actual business, right? The bottom line is affected by that. Company culture is affected by that. Employee well-being, which is of utmost importance, is affected by that. And I've seen, you know, really clear instances where when organizations separate it and the leadership is not in alignment around that's where the failure comes. And in contrast, I've seen real purposeful, integrated, intentional implementation and and integration of strategy that is related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's been successful. So I think that, and that comes from people not understanding the relationship with success, right? With organizational success, it's reliant upon that. It's reliant upon inclusion. I'll give you an example. There was a McKinsey study that looked at adoption of digital technology in companies. And they had 10 factors around what was, a key to success with the adoption of digital technologies. And what was the number one factor? It was culture. Yeah. It was people and culture, appreciating it, understanding it. It wasn't anything around know-how, or even people thought it would be resources like budget allocation. They thought it was the technical aspects of it. It wasn't. The top line on it was organizational culture, right? And so when we throw money at and investment of effort and resources at other parts of the business completely blind to this, it's particularly ineffective. Absolutely. So I think the call to action here is to understand, not just in reaction. I understand we're in a crisis and we are reacting, but not just in reaction to what is going on, but how can we leverage this, right? Like, how can this reach us forward towards more success?
Thanks so much for both of you. So I think it's really interesting that you two both spoke about this at different levels, right? Wyle spoke primarily about the importance of leadership humility and how that then infiltrates the whole organization. And Farzana spoke about it more from a strategic and overall organizational cultural level, and how, you know, those are two different starting places when you can get to similar outcomes. So thanks for that. I'm going to ask one last question. I've got two questions from Jessica and Darren, but they both relate to employee wellness. And so we're going to kind of try to combine them here. I'm sorry to Jessica and Darren if I butcher this a little bit. But Jessica's concerned particularly about right now during the pandemic. She's seeing entry-level employees who are worried about working because of their health. And so managers are working on overdrive to cover for the team members, right? Which is a wonderful thing to be concerned about the wellness of your team, but she's worried that this is unsustainable. And she's wondering, how can you, care for employee wellness in the longer term in a more sustainable way? And then Darren asks about, and I think this is a really good question for the two of you who do consulting with organizations. And she's wondering, actually, I don't know if Darren is a she or he, sorry, can individual leaders facilitate these conversations with their teams, with conversation starters, or should they be facilitated by DEI facilitators and trained individuals? And I think that's a really good, great question. And Sam, I'm sorry, I'm not gonna get to yours today. We're running out of time. But if the two of you could answer that last question, that would be really great.
Farzana?
Yeah, I think it relates to what I said earlier around resources and policies. So if someone is in fear and can't perform, the productivity is already not going to be 100%. So we have to acknowledge that. So are there different, is there dialogue that needs to be happening? Is there supportive community? Are there wellness resources that are needed? And if the managers are strained, then that means the resources aren't allocated to cover that, right? So that looks like it's a dynamic around the organization and possibly HR and structuring of work. Now, there's a deeper issue here, though, which is around supporting your employees. So if we see employees as the stopgap here or the issue, we're looking at it wrong. Because look how, for lack of a better word, expensive it would be to have an employee leave and to have that turnover. So your best investment is to support your employees. So if you're not allocating resources, you're really shooting yourself in the foot because of that. At the same time, we've got to care for people, especially right now. That's got to be, the number one cause and mission and vision. That comes forward in everything. And as related to can folks facilitate discussions around DEI? There are a lot of resources around doing this. It's not something that you can feel fearful of. In that there are numerous resources that you could find for ways to start that or to do your own training around it. So I think it's really empowering you to not be perfect and to model that and to invite community dialogue and be able to necessitate some of this growth journey together. So I think part of it is just understanding that we're not trying to actually reach a destination here. We're trying to go through this process. And if coronavirus has taught us anything, it's to slow down and look at our processes. And that's the opportunity here.
Absolutely. So that for that conversation, you don't have to be an expert in equity and diversity and inclusion to have these conversations. You have to be a good facilitator. You have to be a person who can connect with people. You have to be a person who can listen and not judge and provide a safe space. And there are ways to do that. And there are people who are good at that in your organization, I'm sure. They're just like good connectors with people. They make them feel safe. They make them talk. They are good listeners. And these are the ones who should manage these conversations.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think those are great answers to finish up on. Thank you everyone for being here. Dawn in the chat at one point had asked about the colors in some of the slides that I had just shared and what that meant. I'll share the slides, and the legend is on the slides so you can see what the different colors meant, and the links to the original research as well. Thank you, huge thank you to Farzana and Wyle. I really, really appreciate you coming here. They both a wealth of wisdom. Highly recommend them both if any of you watching are in organizations and you wanted some support. And to the rest of you, good luck as we come out of this pandemic and we all figure this out together. So good luck to all of us, and thank you very much.